Jake had always loved the solitude of his ranch. For as long as he could remember, it had been his sanctuary, a place where the world's troubles felt miles away. The land, the animals, the long hours of hard work, it all brought him peace. Ranching was more than a job. It was a way of life, one that had been passed down from his father, and from his father before him. The ranch wasn't just land, it was his heritage, his family's story, and his future. The thought of it made Jake feel grounded. It was where he had learned everything: how to work the soil, tend to the animals, and keep the farm running smoothly. It was home. When Jake was deployed overseas, his mind was always on his work. His duties were clear, and he threw himself into the mission, as he always did. But despite the long hours, there was always a part of him that longed for the ranch. He couldn't help but think about it. The rolling fields, the wide open sky, the familiar sounds of the animals. Even though he had a responsibility to his country, part of him always felt connected to the land. It was where he had spent his childhood, where his family's legacy lay. It was his future. But that future, he never imagined, would be taken from him while he was away. The call came early one morning while Jake was sitting in his barracks, eating breakfast. His brother's name flashed across the screen, and Jake instantly felt a knot form in his stomach. His brother rarely called him during his deployment, so the timing was strange. He picked up the phone, trying to sound casual, but something in his brother's tone told him something was wrong. "Jake, I don't know how to say this, but you need to know. The HOA, they sold the ranch." Jake's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced, trying to process what he was hearing. The HOA? The ranch? Sold? He had to be hearing things. "What do you mean, sold?" Jake's voice was shaky as he stood up, pacing the small room. "They can't just sell it. That's my land, my family's land. No one can sell it without my permission." "I don't know how it happened," his brother said, his voice full of frustration. "But the paperwork was signed. The house, the land, the cattle, it's all gone. The HOA sold it while you were overseas. It's all been transferred to a new owner." Jake's head was spinning. The words didn't make sense. Jake's father had worked that land with his own hands, teaching Jake the ways of the farm. It was more than just a piece of property. It was a legacy, a family home. And now, just like that, it was gone. He couldn't process it. It didn't make sense. How could the HOA, an organization that was supposed to serve the neighborhood, sell his land without his knowledge or permission? "No, this can't be right," Jake said, pacing back and forth in the small room, running his hand through his hair. "They don't have the authority to do that. How could they even think they could sell it without me knowing?" "They can't," his brother's voice cut through his thoughts, but it didn't bring the comfort Jake was hoping for. "I don't know how they did it, Jake. I tried to stop it, but it was too late. The paperwork was all signed, and the new owner's already been given the deed. I don't even know who they sold it to. It happened so fast, and no one told you." Jake's heart sank. It was like a nightmare. The ranch wasn't just a piece of land. It was his. It had been in the family for generations. It had been his father's dream, and Jake had always believed it would be his, too. How could something like this happen without him being informed? The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The family's ranch, the one thing he had always believed would stay with him, was now in the hands of someone else. And he wasn't even there to stop it. "You have to do something," Jake said, his voice rising with frustration. "I'm not going to let them get away with this. Who do we call? We need to fix this." He could feel the anger building inside him. The helplessness of being so far away, unable to do anything, only made it worse. His brother tried to calm him down, but Jake wasn't listening. He had to get home. He had to make sure that no one was going to get away with stealing his family's land. "I need to get back," Jake said, his voice low but determined. "I don't care what it takes. I'll get home, and I'll fix this." His brother hesitated. "You know how the army works, Jake. It's not that simple. You can't just leave in the middle of your deployment." Jake's jaw tightened. "I don't care. The ranch is mine, and I'm not letting anyone take it from me. His brother sighed. I'll start making calls, get you the best lawyer I can find. But you need to focus on your mission right now. You can't let this distract you. Jake felt torn. His duty was to the army, but his heart was at the ranch. His family needed him, and he couldn't let this go without taking action. I'll handle it, Jake said, his voice firm. But I'm coming home. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. The call ended, but Jake's mind didn't stop spinning. The ranch, his family's legacy, his future. It was all slipping away, and he had to do something about it. He couldn't just sit back and let the HOA take what wasn't theirs. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. How could Karen, the HOA president, allow something like this to happen? How could they sell his land without his permission? The answers weren't clear, but one thing was, Jake had to get home, and he had to take action fast. As the days passed, Jake started looking for a way to get back. He pushed through his deployment with a singular focus, getting home to reclaim what was rightfully his. His commanding officer saw the determination in Jake's eyes and eventually signed off on his request to return home. I understand, Jake. This is important to you, and I know you'll handle it when you get back. But keep your head on straight out there. With his commanding officer's approval, Jake knew it was only a matter of time before he could return home and fight for the ranch. As the flight back to America took off, Jake's stomach twisted with anticipation. His future, his family's land, and everything he had worked for was on the line. The battle was just beginning, and Jake knew he wasn't going to back down. Jake wasted no time once he was back on American soil. His body was tired from the long flight, but his mind was focused on one thing, the ranch. The feeling of disbelief still lingered in his chest, and the more he thought about it, the more the anger built. The ranch wasn't just a piece of land to him. It was his inheritance, his family's legacy, and now it was gone. The HOA had stolen it right out from under him. He needed answers. As soon as he landed, Jake wasted no time heading straight to the HOA office. He had already called ahead, letting them know he was coming. He didn't want to waste a single moment. The day was still young, but he knew that time was against him. The longer the HOA kept the ranch, the harder it would be to get it back. He parked his truck outside the familiar, squat building that housed the HOA office. It was a place that had always rubbed him the wrong way. Too many rules, too much control over the lives of people who just wanted to live peacefully. As he walked toward the door, he could feel the tension rising in his chest. This wasn't just a casual visit. This was a confrontation. The door swung open as Jake entered, and the first thing he saw was Karen, the HOA president. She was sitting behind her desk, her back to him, focused on a stack of papers. When she heard the door open, she didn't even bother to look up. She already knew who it was. Jake, she said, her voice dripping with feigned politeness. I assume you're here to discuss the ranch. She didn't turn around to face him. Her tone was calm, almost too calm, like she wasn't concerned in the slightest. Jake's fists clenched. He couldn't believe how casually she was acting about the situation. His property was gone, sold without his knowledge or consent. And here she was, acting like it was just another day in the office. Yeah, we need to talk, Jake said, his voice firm, though he could feel his anger bubbling just beneath the surface. You sold my ranch, Karen. My land. How dare you? She finally turned around, and Jake could see the flash of irritation in her eyes, though she quickly masked it with a smile. Jake, you're making this more difficult than it needs to be, she said, her tone still unnervingly calm. The sale was legal. You weren't here. The land had to be sold. The land didn't have to be sold, Jake shot back, stepping forward. You didn't have the right to sell it. You can't just take something that doesn't belong to you. Karen sighed dramatically, as if she was the one being inconvenienced. Jake, you're overseas. The HOA is responsible for managing the property in the community. You were not here to maintain your land. We had to make the decision for the good of the neighborhood. Jake could feel his blood boil as he listened to her spin her lies. She was twisting the truth to suit her needs, and it was clear she didn't care about the impact it had on him. You didn't have the authority to do this. The land is mine, and you had no right to sell it while I was away, Jake said, his voice rising with frustration. You never even told me. Not a single word. Karen leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. You should have made arrangements if you were going to be gone for so long. The HOA couldn't just leave the property in limbo. We had to act. Act. Jake repeated, his voice tight with anger. You didn't act, Karen. You took my ranch. You took everything my family worked for and sold it to the highest bidder. That's theft. Karen's eyes flashed with irritation, and she straightened up in her chair, clearly trying to regain some control of the situation. You're being unreasonable, Jake. The decision was made. It's final. The new owners have already taken possession of the property. There's nothing you can do about it now. Jake's chest tightened with frustration. He had never been the type to back down, but the more Karen spoke, the more it felt like she was trying to wear him down, trying to convince him that this was just the way things had to be. He refused to believe that. This is not over, Karen, Jake said, his voice low and steady. You sold my property without my permission, and you're going to pay for it. He stood there for a moment, staring at Karen, trying to decide his next move. This was bigger than just getting the ranch back. It was about taking a stand against the HOA and their overreach, their manipulation, and their control. I'll be getting a lawyer, Jake said finally. And I'm going to fight this. You can't just do whatever you want. Karen smirked, clearly dismissing his threat. Do what you must, Jake. But I assure you, you won't win. The sale is final, and the new owners have already started making plans for the property. It's out of your hands. Jake stood still for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He knew Karen wasn't going to back down. She was as stubborn as they came. But that didn't mean he was going to give up. He had fought for everything he had in his life, and this was no different. We'll see about that, Jake said, his voice cold. He turned and walked out of the office, the door swinging shut behind him with a quiet thud. As he stepped out into the bright sunlight, Jake's mind raced. The fight was far from over. The HOA had sold his ranch, but that didn't mean they had one. He would get the ranch back. He would make sure the new owners understood that they were standing on stolen land. This wasn't just about property rights anymore. It was about something bigger, something personal. His family's legacy was being taken from him, and he wasn't going to let that happen. As Jake got into his truck and started the engine, a surge of determination filled him. The battle had just begun. Karen and the HOA had made a mistake, and Jake wasn't going to rest until he made them pay for it. Jake's mind raced after leaving the HOA office. Karen's words echoed in his ears, each one a reminder of how the HOA had overstepped its bounds and taken what wasn't theirs. His family's land, his legacy, had been sold while he was overseas, and nothing Karen had said could justify it. Jake wasn't the type to sit idly by, letting the situation unfold without a plan. No, he wasn't going to back down. Not now. But he knew this battle wouldn't be easy. The HOA had power, resources, and the support of the community, at least for now. Jake couldn't fight them alone. Not if he wanted to win. That's when it hit him. He had an advantage that Karen didn't know about: his connection to the military. As an officer in the army, Jake had access to resources and support that could turn the tide in his favor. He'd served his country faithfully for years, and now, it was time to call in that favor. Jake pulled out his phone and dialed the number of his commanding officer, Colonel Roberts. The line clicked, and the familiar voice came through. Jake, what's going on? You've got a serious tone in your voice. Everything all right? Not exactly, sir, Jake replied, his voice tight with frustration. I need your help. The HOA sold my family's ranch while I was overseas. They did it without my consent, and now I'm trying to figure out how to get it back. But I can't do this on my own. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Colonel Roberts spoke. You're telling me the HOA took your land? Just like that? Jake's jaw clenched. Exactly. I've been back for a few days now, and I've already spoken to Karen, the president of the HOA. She's stonewalling me, and it's clear she's trying to cover her tracks. I've already got the legal side of things started. But I need something more. I need leverage. Colonel Roberts sighed, and Jake could almost hear him thinking through the situation. You've always been a fighter, Jake. You've done your duty to your country, and I respect that. This is a personal matter, but you've got the right to fight for your land. I'll get in touch with some of our legal experts, and we'll see what we can do. I've got a few contacts who can help with the legal side. I'll also make a few calls to some of our friends in high places. If the HOA is using their power for personal gain, we'll make sure they know we're watching. Jake felt a surge of relief, but he knew that this was just the beginning. Thank you, sir. I won't let this go. I know you won't, Colonel Roberts replied. I'll get back to you soon with what we can do. In the meantime, stay focused. I'm sure Karen will try to retaliate in some way, but you've got the army behind you now. We've got this. Jake hung up the phone, a sense of determination filling him. This fight wasn't just about reclaiming his property anymore. It was about standing up against abuse of power and making sure the HOA knew that they couldn't just push people around. With the backing of the military, Jake now had more than just legal support. He had muscle behind him. But even with that, he knew the battle wouldn't be easy. The HOA wasn't going to give up their power easily. As the days passed, Jake focused on preparing for the next steps. He spoke with his lawyer, Frank Hamilton, about the legal strategy moving forward. Frank was a seasoned attorney, and Jake had full confidence in his ability to navigate the intricacies of the case. But the legal process would take time, and time was something Jake didn't have. The longer the new owners of the ranch held onto the property, the harder it would be to reclaim. As Jake worked on the legal side of things, he continued to gather information. He started reaching out to neighbors and community members who might have had experiences with the HOA. He had heard whispers about the HOA's overreach before, but he had never fully understood just how far they were willing to go to assert their power. One evening, Jake sat down with Carl, an older man who lived a few properties down from the ranch. Carl had been around for years and was one of the few people who hadn't been intimidated by Karen's tactics. You've been dealing with the HOA for a long time, Carl, Jake said, leaning forward. Tell me the truth. How far will they go to protect their interests? Carl leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Jake, I've seen this before. They're not just about managing the neighborhood, they're about control. They'll use whatever means they can to get what they want. I've heard rumors that Karen's been in bed with developers for years, making deals behind closed doors. They've sold property before, under the guise of community improvements, but it's always about money. It's always about power. Jake listened carefully, the weight of Carl's words sinking in. So, this isn't just a mistake. This is part of something bigger. Exactly, Carl said. And once they've got their claws in something, it's hard to get them out. They don't like being challenged, especially not by someone like you, someone who's not afraid to fight back. Jake nodded, his resolve hardening. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. The ranch was his, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it. I'm going to take them down, Jake said, his voice firm. I've got the army's support, and now it's time to use it. We'll do this right. We'll make sure Karen and the HOA know that they can't just walk all over people. As the conversation ended, Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The HOA had power, and Karen wasn't going to let go of that control easily. But now Jake had something on his side that they didn't. He had leverage, he had the army's backing, and most importantly, he had the truth on his side. As Jake walked back to his truck that evening, he looked out over the land. The sun was setting over the ranch, casting long shadows across the fields. He could almost hear his father's voice in the wind, telling him to stand tall and fight for what was right. The battle was just beginning, but Jake was ready. The army would back him, and the law would follow. But no matter what happened, he would not let Karen and the HOA take away his family's legacy. Jake's mind was racing. He had known from the moment he stepped out of the HOA office and heard Karen's dismissive words that the battle wasn't going to be easy. The HOA had made it clear they weren't going to back down without a fight. But now that he had the army's backing and the law on his side, Jake felt more determined than ever to reclaim what was rightfully his. The legal process was a maze, one Jake had never navigated before. He had always been someone who dealt with things head-on, whether it was on the ranch or in the field. But this was different. The fight was now in the hands of lawyers, judges, and the legal system. Jake knew he had to trust the process, but that didn't mean he could sit back and wait. He needed to move fast. The longer the new owners held onto the ranch, the more complicated it would be to reverse the sale. Time was ticking. As Jake met with his lawyer, Frank Hamilton, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Frank was an experienced attorney, but even he knew this wasn't going to be an easy case. "Jake, we've got a solid case, but it's not going to be quick," Frank said as he looked over the papers Jake had gathered. "The HOA has a lot of resources, and they're not going to give up their control easily. But we can make this work. We've got the evidence, and we've got the army backing us." Jake nodded, his resolve hardening. "I'm not backing down, Frank. I've worked too hard for that land, and I won't let them steal it." "I know, Jake," Frank replied, his voice calm but serious. "But you need to be prepared. The HOA has a lot of power, and they'll fight tooth and nail to protect their interests. They're going to try everything they can to discredit you, delay the case, and get you to back off. You need to be ready for that." Jake sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "What's the next step?" he asked. Frank leaned forward, pulling up a legal document on his laptop. "We start by filing a formal complaint with the court. We'll argue that the sale of your property was done illegally, and we'll demand that it be reversed. We'll also file for damages because of the harm they've caused you." Jake's mind started to race as Frank spoke. He had to admit, he didn't fully understand all the legal jargon, but the thought of taking back what was his gave him the strength to keep going. Frank continued, "We'll need to gather more evidence. The HOA has a lot of paperwork that we'll need to sift through. We'll also want to contact the developer who bought your land to see if they knew about the illegal nature of the sale. It's going to take time, but we've got a good case." "How long do you think this will take?" Jake asked. Frank looked grim. "It could take months, maybe even longer. The HOA will try to drag this out as long as possible. They'll use every legal loophole to slow things down." Jake exhaled deeply, his fists clenching. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he was prepared to do whatever it took. He wasn't just fighting for his land. He was fighting for everything his father had worked for, everything that had been passed down to him. "I'm in this for the long haul," Jake said firmly. "We've got to win." Over the next few days, Jake threw himself into the legal battle. He worked closely with Frank to gather evidence, contacting witnesses and tracking down old documents that could help their case. The more they dug, the more they uncovered about the HOA's illegal actions. The documents showed that Karen and the HOA had been abusing their power for years, bypassing homeowners to sell property without their consent. It wasn't just Jake's ranch that had been taken. There were other instances of HOA overreach, but Jake's case was by far the most egregious. The deeper they got, the angrier Jake became. It wasn't just about the ranch anymore. It was about fighting back against a system that had taken advantage of homeowners for far too long. The HOA had been a bully, using its position to intimidate and control, and Jake wasn't going to let that stand. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't sitting idly by either. She knew Jake was coming for her, and she wasn't going to go down without a fight. Jake received numerous threats, anonymous phone calls and messages warning him to back off and let it go. Some were more direct than others, like the one that came in the middle of the night, telling him, "You'll regret this." Jake wasn't afraid of the threats. He had heard worse during his time in the military, but what made him angry was the sheer audacity of it all. Karen had no right to take what wasn't hers, and no amount of intimidation was going to make him back down. The tension in the neighborhood started to build. Jake could feel the weight of the situation growing heavier with each passing day. Some of the neighbors, who had once been friendly, started to distance themselves. They had heard the rumors, and Karen's influence was still strong. Some people were afraid of speaking out. Others didn't want to get caught in the middle of a legal battle. But there were also those who supported Jake, who had grown tired of the HOA's control. They knew that if Jake succeeded, it would mean freedom for everyone. The legal process dragged on. Jake spent countless hours preparing documents, meeting with his lawyer, and trying to get the evidence they needed. The pressure was mounting. The closer they got to the court date, the more difficult it became to keep his mind focused. But Jake refused to quit. He wasn't just fighting for his land. He was fighting for his father's legacy and for the future of the community. As the date for the court hearing drew closer, Jake prepared himself for the long battle ahead. He knew it wasn't going to be easy. The HOA had deep pockets, and Karen had the legal team to back her up. But Jake had something they didn't: the truth, the army, and a community that was beginning to stand behind him. The war wasn't over, but it had already begun. The weight of the legal battle was beginning to settle heavily on Jake's shoulders. The more he thought about it, the more frustrated he became. He had expected a long fight, but the uncertainty, the pressure from both Karen and the HOA, was starting to wear him down. But Jake wasn't someone who gave up easily. He had been taught from a young age that hard work and perseverance were the only ways to get things done. This was no different. His father had worked tirelessly to build that ranch, and Jake was determined to do the same to protect it. He knew that the HOA wasn't going to roll over. They had power, money, and connections. But Jake had something they didn't: the army, his own grit, and the truth on his side. That alone was a weapon more powerful than anything they could throw at him. With Frank's help, Jake started building his case more aggressively. They began reaching out to more witnesses, gathering evidence from other homeowners who had suffered at the hands of the HOA's manipulation. It became clear that Jake wasn't the only one who had been wronged. The HOA had systematically undermined homeowners, selling off properties without their consent and pocketing the proceeds. But what was even more troubling was that they had done it for years, under the guise of community improvement and property value enhancement. As Jake worked with Frank to piece together the puzzle, he began to see a pattern. The HOA had been running a scheme, using their position to make money off of unsuspecting homeowners. But the more Jake uncovered, the more it became apparent that Karen was at the heart of it all. She had been pulling the strings, manipulating her position to push her own agenda. But Jake wasn't about to let her get away with it. One evening, as Jake sat in his kitchen going over more legal documents, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Carl, his neighbor, someone who had lived in the community for decades. Jake had always known Carl to be quiet, a man who preferred to keep to himself. But Carl had been one of the first to offer support when Jake's fight with the HOA began. The message was brief, but it was enough to make Jake's heart race. "Jake, I know you've been working hard on this case, but Karen's up to something. She's meeting with someone at the diner tomorrow. I don't know who it is, but it's suspicious. Thought you should know." Jake's mind immediately went into overdrive. Karen was always up to something, always scheming to keep her control intact. He had no idea who she was meeting, but he couldn't afford to ignore it. He texted Carl back quickly, thanking him for the heads-up, and decided to take matters into his own hands. He wasn't about to sit back and wait for Karen to make her next move. The next morning, Jake drove into town earlier than usual, making sure to park his truck a few blocks away from the diner. He didn't want to be noticed. He wasn't sure what Karen was up to, but he needed to find out. As he walked past the small shops on Main Street, he could feel his pulse quicken. The closer he got to the diner, the more the tension in his chest grew. He pushed open the door and stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room quickly. The diner was small, cozy, with a handful of regulars scattered around. At the back table, Jake spotted Karen. She was sitting across from a man he didn't recognize. They were talking quietly, their heads close together. Jake couldn't make out their conversation, but the body language was telling. Karen was leaning in, speaking in hushed tones, and the man seemed to be listening intently, nodding every now and then. Jake couldn't take his eyes off them. There was something about the whole situation that felt wrong. He wasn't sure who the man was, but the fact that Karen was meeting with him secretly meant something was afoot. Jake knew he couldn't just sit there and watch. He had to know what they were planning. Quietly, he moved toward the counter and ordered a coffee, making sure to sit with his back to Karen. From where he sat, he had a clear view of their table without being obvious. He listened closely, trying to catch bits and pieces of their conversation. What he overheard made his blood run cold. "Jake's not going to back down," Karen was saying, her voice low but full of venom. "We need to find a way to keep him in check, or this whole thing will fall apart. The ranch isn't just any property, it's a key part of our plans. We can't afford to lose it." The man across from her nodded slowly, his eyes dark and calculating. "I understand. But we've already sold the land, Karen. What more do you want?" Karen's eyes narrowed. "I want control. If we can't keep Jake from reclaiming the ranch, we'll have to find another way to make it work for us. We can't let him win this." Jake's heart pounded as he heard those words. This wasn't just about the ranch anymore. This was about something bigger, something more insidious. Karen wasn't just trying to win. She was trying to make sure that no one, especially Jake, could stop her plans. But Jake wasn't going to let her get away with it. He was determined now more than ever to take her down. He couldn't let her manipulate the community any longer. He had the army, the legal support, and most importantly, the community's backing. But now, with this new information, he realized that he had to act faster. He couldn't wait for the legal system to sort it out. Karen was already working behind the scenes to make sure Jake lost, and Jake knew he couldn't let that happen. He finished his coffee and stood up, his mind racing with the new information. As he walked out of the diner, he knew what he had to do next. This was no longer just about legalities or paperwork. This was about stopping Karen before she could put her plans into motion. He had to outsmart her, and he had to do it quickly. He walked out into the cool morning air, already making plans in his head. The war wasn't over yet, but Jake had a new fire inside him. The game had just changed, and now, he had the upper hand. Jake's resolve had never been stronger, but the fight was far from over. The discovery of Karen's secret meeting was a game changer. It was clear now that the HOA, led by Karen, wasn't just trying to push him out of the picture. They were trying to take control of everything, using every dirty tactic they could think of. And Jake wasn't going to let that happen. He had worked too hard, fought too many battles, and lost too much to let this go. He had to confront Karen head-on, once and for all. Jake knew he couldn't do it alone. The legal side of things was already in motion, but with the revelation that Karen was plotting behind the scenes, Jake knew he needed to step up his game. He couldn't rely on lawyers and paperwork alone. He needed action. The next morning, Jake met with Frank Hamilton, his lawyer, and a few of his trusted neighbors who had been helping with the case. Everyone was on edge, but Jake could see the determination in their eyes. They had reached a breaking point. "Jake, we've got a solid case," Frank said, leaning over the legal papers. "We've built up enough evidence, and the army's support is helping. But Karen is getting desperate. I can tell. She's pulling all the strings now, trying to make this go her way." Jake nodded. He wasn't surprised. He had seen Karen's manipulative side for years. She had always been the type to push the boundaries and test limits. But now, it was clear that she was willing to do anything to protect her own interests. "What's the next step?" Jake asked, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. "We're filing the lawsuit today," Frank said, his voice steady. "We'll push for a court order to halt the sale of the land and reverse the transfer to the new owners. The evidence is stacked in your favor, Jake. But the moment we file, Karen's going to make a move. She won't go down without a fight. You need to be ready for what she throws at us next." Jake's heart raced. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a personal war. His father's legacy, his home, everything he had worked for was on the line. He couldn't afford to lose. "I'm ready," Jake said, his voice low but firm. "Let's do this." The lawsuit was filed later that afternoon, and the pressure was immediate. Within hours, Karen and the HOA were scrambling to respond. Jake had expected this. He knew she wasn't going to sit back and let this happen without a fight. But he wasn't prepared for what came next. That evening, Jake received an unexpected call. It was from one of his neighbors, Carl. "Jake, you're not going to believe this," Carl said, his voice tense. "Karen's planning something. I overheard her talking to some of the developers. She's trying to make a deal with them to buy the land back, even after the sale was reversed. She's planning to use the HOA's power to get the new owners on her side." Jake clenched his fists. "She's not stopping, is she?" "No," Carl said, his voice grim. "She's not. But I don't think she knows what's coming. She's underestimated you, Jake. She's got a lot of influence, but people are starting to wake up. You've got more support than she realizes." Jake's resolve hardened. Karen thought she had control, but she was wrong. This wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about taking down the corruption that had been festering for so long. Jake had no intention of letting her walk away from this without facing the consequences. The next morning, Jake and Frank met again, this time in a conference room with a team of lawyers, military advisors, and a few trusted neighbors. The stakes had gotten higher, and Jake knew that the battle was entering its final phase. "We've got a plan," Frank said, outlining the strategy for the day. "The moment Karen makes her move, we're going to strike back. We'll go public with the evidence, we'll get the press involved, and we'll force her into a corner. She can't keep using the HOA to cover her tracks. It's time to expose everything she's been doing." Jake felt the fire building inside him. He had fought for everything he had, and now it was time to fight for his future. "Let's take her down," Jake said, his voice thick with determination. As the day went on, Jake felt the tension building. Every call, every piece of information seemed to point to one inevitable showdown with Karen. He knew she would try to retaliate, but this time, she wouldn't win. By the time the court hearing was scheduled, Jake had gathered his support. The community, once divided by fear, had now united behind him. His neighbors, people who had been silent for years, intimidated by the HOA's power, were now speaking out. They were ready to take a stand. The moment Jake entered the courthouse, he could feel the weight of the situation settle over him. Karen and her lawyers were already in the room, sitting at the front. But Jake wasn't intimidated. He was prepared. Frank had worked tirelessly to put together the case, and now it was time for Karen to face the consequences of her actions. As the judge entered, the room grew silent. Jake's heart beat faster, but he remained calm, focused. The judge called the court to order, and the case began. Frank presented their evidence, laying out the timeline of the illegal sale, the manipulation by the HOA, and Karen's blatant disregard for Jake's property rights. Each piece of evidence was more damning than the last, and Karen's smug expression slowly began to fade. She had no answer for the mounting evidence against her. As Frank finished his closing arguments, Jake felt a sense of satisfaction. This was it. The truth was finally coming to light. Karen had no way to defend her actions now. The judge took his time, reviewing the case carefully. The tension in the room was unbearable. After what felt like an eternity, the judge finally spoke. "In light of the evidence presented, I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Jake. The sale of the land to the new owners is hereby reversed. The HOA's actions were illegal, and the defendants are required to pay restitution to Mr. Jake for the damages caused. This court also orders the immediate removal of the pipeline and any structures built on the property without Mr. Jake's consent." The courtroom was silent for a moment, and then the murmurs began. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, but he stood tall, knowing he had won. Karen and the HOA had lost. The land was his once more. Karen stood up, her face red with anger and humiliation. She didn't speak a word as she stormed out of the courtroom, defeated. Jake's victory wasn't just a personal one. It was a victory for the entire community. Karen's reign of control was over. The fight for Jake's ranch was far from over, but this was the turning point. He had won, and the community had won with him. As Jake walked out of the courthouse, he could see the smiles on the faces of his neighbors who had supported him all along. They had fought together, and now, the HOA's grip on the neighborhood was finally broken. Jake had done it. The ranch was his again, and Karen's corruption had been exposed for everyone to see. The battle was over, but the war for his future had just begun. Jake had won the battle, but the war was far from over. As he stood outside the courthouse, the weight of what had just transpired began to settle in. The judge's decision had been a huge victory, but it wasn't just about the legal win. It was about the message it sent to Karen and the HOA. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt like the underdog had finally triumphed. He had fought for his land, for his family's legacy, and for the truth, and now, the HOA couldn't hide from what they had done. But even as he stood there, feeling the rush of relief and triumph, Jake knew that the fight wasn't truly over. This was just one chapter in a much larger story, and he still had to deal with the aftermath of the battle. As Jake walked out of the courthouse, his mind was flooded with thoughts of what came next. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Frank, his lawyer, calling with the news Jake had been waiting for. "Jake, the court ruling is official. You've got your land back. But you know Karen isn't going to take this lightly. I wouldn't be surprised if she tries to appeal or find some other way to fight back. She won't go down without a fight." Jake's stomach tightened. He had expected as much. He knew Karen wouldn't just let this go. She would use every trick in the book to try to turn the tables again. But Jake wasn't worried anymore. With the evidence they had, and the strength of the community behind him, he knew they had won. The HOA's power had been shattered, and it was only a matter of time before Karen's influence in the neighborhood crumbled as well. "I know, Frank," Jake replied, his voice steady. "But we've won. This time, she doesn't have the upper hand. We've exposed everything she's done, and people are starting to see through her lies. The HOA is done." Frank chuckled on the other end of the line. "You're right about that. And now, we make sure everyone knows it. You've got the support of the entire neighborhood. People are starting to speak out, and Karen can't keep using fear and manipulation to control them. You've set an example for everyone. You've shown them that standing up for what's right works." Jake couldn't help but smile. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace. The battle had been long and exhausting, but it had been worth it. The ranch, his family's land, was safe once more. "Thanks, Frank," Jake said, feeling the weight lift off his shoulders. "We've done it. Now, it's time to rebuild." As Jake ended the call, he took a deep breath and looked out over the land. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the fields, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the ranch felt like home again. But the victory wasn't just about reclaiming the land. It was about something deeper. It was about reclaiming control, about standing up against corruption, and about ensuring that no one could ever take what was rightfully his again. As Jake stood there, soaking in the beauty of the land, his neighbors began to gather around him. Carl, who had been with Jake from the very beginning, was the first to approach. "You did it, Jake," Carl said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't back down, and you got your ranch back. You've given the rest of us hope that we don't have to live in fear anymore." Jake shook Carl's hand, his grip firm. "It wasn't just me," Jake said, his voice filled with gratitude. "This was a fight for all of us. You, the rest of the community, you all stood with me. We've won together." The rest of the neighbors began to gather, each one expressing their thanks and admiration. For the first time in years, the HOA's grip on the neighborhood was broken. The fear, the intimidation, the control, it was all gone. People began speaking up, sharing their stories of how the HOA had taken advantage of them, how Karen and her cohorts had bullied them into silence. It was clear that the neighborhood had been living in the shadow of the HOA for far too long, and now that shadow had finally been lifted. As the night went on, Jake could feel the sense of unity in the air. For years, the community had been fractured, divided by fear and manipulation. But now, they were coming together. They were ready to take back their neighborhood, to rebuild what had been torn apart by Karen and the HOA. Jake stood on his porch, looking out at the faces of his neighbors, and he realized that this wasn't just a personal victory, it was a community victory. They had all fought together, and now they could all share in the triumph. "This is just the beginning," Jake said, his voice strong as he addressed the group. We've taken back our land, but there's more to do. We have to make sure this never happens again. We need to stand together and make sure Karen and the HOA can never hurt anyone again." The crowd nodded in agreement, their faces filled with determination. They knew that this victory was just the first step. The HOA was done, but the work of rebuilding the community had just begun. As the evening wore on, Jake felt a sense of peace wash over him. His fight for the ranch had been hard, but it had brought his community together in a way he had never imagined. And now, with the HOA out of the picture, the future looked brighter than it ever had before. Jake didn't know what the future held, but one thing was for sure: he was ready for whatever came next. The army had his back, the community had his back, and with the truth on his side, there was no challenge too big to face. He was no longer just fighting for his ranch. He was fighting for the future of his community. And that was a fight worth winning.